This is Season 4, Episode 5 of Mastering the RPG, a tabletop RPG podcast all about upping your game. Doesn't matter if you're a game master or player, you'll find advice, ideas, and some strong opinions. Our episode tonight is Running Factions in a Tabletop RPG, or Don't You Know Who I Work For? Everyone, again, welcome to Mastering the RPG. Like I said, we're a podcast all about upping your game, cool ideas, a little opinion, all sorts of good stuff like that. I'm Carl with my co-hosts Eric and Chris, and you'll find all our information at masteringtherpg.com. If you have an email or feedback, questions, whatever, game master at masteringtherpg.com. Well, hello, gentlemen. How are you today?
I'm doing well. How are you guys doing?
Fantastic.
I'm doing all right. I am back. Sorry I missed last episode. We had, unfortunately, our dog passed away, so it wasn't quite up to doing the episode. But I'm here now and feeling okay at this point.
So, what you been up to? I know your game has been coming along.
Oh yeah, through a lot of crazy stuff with them. Very experimental. Try to maybe talk about it at some point, but. Yeah, it's definitely been coming along. I think you're going to get roped in for a chapter coming up, so that should be fun.
As soon as I do my homework.
Yeah, and you're going to be a unique situation, too, where like they're not going to expect you coming in, and we've set it up so you can easily come in and out, with so it narratively makes sense with your character kind of being this old sentient golem that can... just that goes into like slumber, basically goes into hibernation every once in a while. So yeah, it'll be fun.
Very cool. So what have you been up to, Chris?
Yeah, I got mostly my work life is around that Foundry store that I'm making, which should come out next month. I did get to do some playtesting for some Pinnacle stuff that's coming out probably next year. That was kind of cool. My family's out of town right now, so I'm just doing extra work. That's how I relax. Kind of like getting stuff off my plate helps my mental, burden a little bit. And not much other than that. I work pretty solid.
Oh, excellent. Well, it sounds like that was your work is fun, right, for you. So that's a good thing.
Yeah.
So I've been playing my game. I'm going to try to get into Eric's game, and as I'm off to do, I get a burr in my saddle, and I decided, as most people have heard, I got a Stream Deck dice roller, and I made it so I could integrate with Foundry and integrate with OBS, and I decided to write a chat bot for Discord that would integrate with it. I don't know why, but I decided to do that. So I wrote a Discord bot. It's very exciting, but anyway, so that's what I've been up to. Maybe I should prep more, but anyway, that's what I've been doing. So hey, what's kind of cool is we got a couple of emails from folks, and I'd love to read them. But first, I've got one from Richard, and it's primarily about Savage Worlds. He also does mention some appreciation for the show, but it's really a couple of questions around Savage Worlds. And I thought, I think the crew here, we were talking off mic, we'll decide to do that as an actual Tabletop Tango episode. Richard did mention that he knew about Tabletop Tango, so when that one's done, we'll mention it on the show and make sure everybody knows that one's out there. But it seemed more appropriate to do an episode there. The second email is from the Free Pie. Sent to us. They say, hey, everyone, I wanted to share some advice on showing the consequences of players' actions in your games. In a Titan Effect campaign I'm running, I came up with the idea of presenting after-mission cutscenes in the form of news reports or articles that reflect the events of the mission. This helps illustrate how the world is reacting to what the players did. It also doubles as a world-building tool, as these news reports can show how unreliable or biased the media is in their version of events. And then continues as an added bonus is that it makes the players feel smart. They know what really happened and can see how others are missing key details. So the generalized advice, they mention it's all about showing the NPCs' reactions, the players' actions, whether through newspapers, gossip, local taverns, radio. It's all great to let the players feel like they had an input, or their impact of the players feel the impact of their exploits on how they fit into a larger world. So that's pretty cool. Then says, hey, enjoying season 4 so far. Looking forward for more episodes, and happy gaming. So I don't know, you guys want to... I love this stuff. So, to pile on that, I love doing this sort of thing in my modern games. Eric was in my Chicagoplex 2090, which was a cyberpunk game, and there was a thing called the Trinity Newsfeed, and there was actually I wish I could remember the NPC's name, who was like the main mouthpiece, the kind of the head guy who would get on the feed and spout things about the team, and actually became part of the story. You guys recruited him into helping you spread the word in certain ways.
Yeah, because he was getting attacked or something. Yeah, you definitely love doing this for sure. And they make a good point. It's definitely easier in modern games when you have like things like podcasts, or which I've also seen in games, or newscasts. But like I said, newspapers, right? Just gossip. I think word of mouth, like going into a town and people are talking about something, is definitely a good way. And like, switching the events. This is also like a really good email for what we're going to be talking about today too. While you can have different factions have their own kind of, news or propaganda or podcast based on the faction, and they'll be saying things that skew in their favor, right? So that's also a fun thing to bring in with factions, and he even have like multiple kind of lines of news coming in that are skewed by the people who are saying it. So yeah, really fun stuff.
Yeah, I recently started at my VTT job. We have like a cyberpunk setting we're gonna start doing, and we've kind of started work a little bit on how to incorporate news feeds and different like digital readouts into backgrounds. So like a electric ticker and or billboard that kind of shows the results of different events in the game. And it's really early on, but it will be super neat when it's done.
Yeah, it's really cool to be able to. It's almost like a recap. Like, I like to have players do recaps, and you do a recap, but it's a recap from a third party who doesn't have all the information or only knows what they see from the outside. And so that can be. It's just fun to have players kind of go, whoa, that's not what happened.
Yeah,
that's not at all. They've got that completely wrong. I'm the good guy here. I'm not the Spider-Man. I'm the good guy. So
you can also do it like in my Fallout game. I had just in the vein of Fallout, I had like a radio DJ, and he would start reading off news, just like in the video game did. I would start reading off news based on what was happening. So it's kind of fun to also act it out yourself as one of the newscasters.
Very cool. Yeah, thank you, the Free Pie. Always great emails from you. Appreciate it. Good stuff. Yeah, I think that's a great idea, and I think folks should take advantage of that. So, well, that is, again, I said we'll take Richard's offline into a Tabletop Tango episode, and so that brings us to the main topic. Everyone, welcome to the main topic. Again, we're talking about running factions in your friendly neighborhood tabletop RPG. I think Eric is going to take the lead tonight to walk us through the outline and dive deep into this. Really, it's a very rich topic, so there's a lot to go through on this one. So, Eric, I'll let you take it away.
Yeah, I almost feel like we could have done this in 2 parts, but
well, maybe if we run out of time, we will.
We'll see. I think, like every episode, it's really important to specifically define what we're talking about, and I think most people know what factions, but I think in our context, in regards to tabletop role-playing games, it's a group of some type of beings, right, who are aligned by religion, goals, desire for power, creed, etc. And this can really vary wildly based on the scope of the game. Okay, so yeah, the scope of the game can change what type of factions you have in it. So if it takes place in like a country, if your game takes place in a country or in a smaller region, then the types of factions you'd have are like the most prevalent religion or a merchant guild or a mercenary company, right? If it's taking place within like a whole continent or a world, then the factions you're talking about are whole countries or even a race of beings, right? Or even some type of major empire, things like that. So, the narrative of the game you're taking place is kind of got to change the level of reach that the factions you're playing with generally are. Also, when we're talking about factions, we're kind of splitting them between major and minor. The major factions I often consider are the main players, and these are the ones that kind of wield the most influence and define the whole, a lot of the narrative of the entire game world, right? A lot of times your game world, when you're writing it, is going to be often written around these major factions. And these often have also the largest failure potential. Minor factions, they still have some sort of power and influence, but it's usually very a narrow focus or area, right, that they kind of operate in. And while they're not always the most powerful, they might be just something like they could be very, very limited in their power, but they could be important to the party themselves. And that's why they have a kind of a place in your game where, if it's a business they all kind of belong to or work for, or there's even like a Pathfinder AP where everybody belongs to a circus, right? The circus itself might be considered a faction. And so, while not big in the world,
It's like the old saying, all politics are local, right? So it's the smaller factions that have the biggest impact on you as a player often. So
so now we've defined them. Let's talk about why do you want factions? And Chris, I'll throw it to you. Why do you want factions in your game?
I think factions are super important to add another layer to the game itself. They're a great source of plot lines and quests, and gives you one thing I think that they are super helpful in is when you have an existing setting and you're worried about continuity with the main historical timeline, and you don't want to change events based on, what historical figures have done. So you can kind of create a faction that then is what your party is working against, rather than any, known people that you can't accidentally kill or something, because it would mess with how the history of the thing goes. I think they add another dimension, a whole different thing. I can be breaking the laws of the city or worried about that, or there's another thieves guild that has an entire separate set of code that I must also obey, even though the sheriff isn't going to get me. They're going to assassinate me when I sleep or something. So it's another whole other dimension on the matrix of different things that you can go through.
Carl, why do you add factions to your games?
Well, I think what's really cool about a faction is they can be antagonists without being big bads. I mean, they're literally working towards a goal, and that goal may be diametrically opposed to what you're thinking, but there may be another faction that is also closer to the way you're thinking, and then you can decide which one is closer to your feelings, which one do you want to work with. And so now it's a role-playing interactive kind of opportunity without just having, people are all bad or people are all good. It's not just evil. They've just got goals that aren't exactly aligned with yours, and maybe the goals aren't really that bad. So that's a really big thing. And I think, like Chris said, it adds some additional. It makes your plots a little more interesting when they're not just sort of a railroad of one thing after another. Now you can go and you can play these side adventures as you get deeper into the culture, the wants, the philosophy of these different factions within the game. I think they really do add a lot of kind of I don't know, background flavor, because the world has got nuance to it, and they add that nuance because of all the things that go into the different people who make up factions. So that's what some of my thoughts on that.
No, I absolutely agree. I mean, I almost think beyond some certain type of games where if you're just in a dungeon crawler, right, or you're lost on an island, but even then, factions are essential, absolutely essential to the fabric of the world. I mean, they are what makes the world, really. I mean, having groups of people, having groups with different goals and desires, like you guys have said, that is what's going to drive most of the narratives in the game. That's what you're going to bounce off of often, right? And sets up the kind of meta narrative as well. Even though you might be in a certain village, just that there's factions in the background doing their things that might affect the village or might affect the country that you're in, things like that, are just so important. And it just brings so much more flavor, like you said, Carl, and dimension to the game. I also think it's really good to be another source of a meta progression beyond like character mechanics, where when you have, factions providing quests or jobs, even if it's just like, not even just like the straight like question mark, like you're in an online game, right? But just having it like be more natural, or there's like a heroes guild or something that you take jobs from them. However you do it, having a progression of like you're gaining influence with the faction, and then you're gaining some type of benefit. That's like just another sense of progression. And I think for players, progression is key, right? Like that gives the most sense of reward is progression, right? So I just think it provides another track of that.
Yeah, I have one more that.
Oh yeah, go on.
If for those of you that write adventures or write material that you reuse or sell, I think if you add factions, giving player choice, meaning they might go through the material in multiple ways, so the replayability becomes higher. So maybe you've game mastered it for one group and they followed the Black Crows or whatever, and that was this faction they supported. So now the material itself has a different outcome, ending, or journey. And then the next time you run it, they decide to support another faction, and the whole thing plays differently. So even the same people can play the same thing twice without, playing the exact same module or adventure or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. And on the top of that point, like they also are a really good way of almost like a fail-safe mechanic, where you can have a big side quest or things happening with the faction, and if the crap hits the fan, you can like sacrifice a faction if you need to. Like if things go totally off the rail, you can kind of sacrifice a faction instead of your whole narrative, right? Instead of like whatever the main quest is, instead of them being responsible, like whatever the main like thing they're pursuing in the main country that they're, whatever it is, right? You can kind of use factions as a way to, if you do run into a wall or do run into trouble, they can just be a great way to kind of salvage your game, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and it's great to have the players feel like they're bigger. They're part of a bigger thing. They're not just five people running around. They're part of, the larger FBI organization, or they're part of the Thieves Guild, or they're part of something bigger where they can find those connections and use them. And ultimately, those connections may sacrifice themselves for what you're saying, Eric, to, help out when things go south, and then they a trusted NPC as part of the faction or set, they're gone now, and you feel that much tighter to this organization that you're part of, to work with them or work against them now because they let that person kind of twitch in the wind or whatever. So there's a lot of opportunities there.
I think that goes right along with that meta progression, right? Like, yeah, once you got a title in this thing, like you're so invested now. So this is interwoven with your character story now. So yeah, you feel a lot of pull one way or the other.
I often find it really beneficial as a game master, like creatively, it helps you bring different things to the world. Like when I make factions for a game I'm running, like the game I'm running now, I have some really just, opposed factions that are all kind of working towards a common goal, but also against each other. But their unique flavor is like, help me. Okay, then this can be like, I'll add this to the world now, and all of this to the world. Like it helps me kind of flesh it out even more, just for writing as myself, to build upon the world into places that you didn't think you would go normally, is what I mean. Like if I didn't create the faction, I wouldn't have done this weird thing, or So it just helps you kind of also as a game master kind of get more juice out of your stuff you're writing.
Well, it gives a framework, right? It's kind of a framework of thinking. As you think through a faction, it gives you an opportunity to put and we'll talk about this, right, as we build them out. But it's another way of doing a framework to help with that creativity, because sometimes putting guardrails around creativity helps actually.
Yeah,
for sure.
I think it's important too, and we sometimes may not really think about it, but a world, especially a world we're building, there's so many lives that move across that world and change the world, and typically you're only focused on the party itself, and that's the only real influence you get to see, at a micro level that changes the world. But as you faction now, you have at least another group, or maybe you have two factions, two other groups that are also traversing all the same landscape and then making their own specific impact too. So it's a little bit more depth that way.
Yeah. Okay, I think we should move on from the why and get to the meat of the episode about actually creating them and using them. So let's actually talk about creating them. So first, when we're talking about creating factions, I just want to again touch on the whole major versus minor kind of part again. And so let's actually get into it, like how you create them differently. So starting with major. Personally, I mean, major factions should usually always be the ones created by a game master when they're actually creating the game itself. Either when you're writing an original story, or like Chris said, even if you're taking a pre-written adventure, you can always create a new faction in to kind of add some spice. But these should be done at the when you're right before players have even been introduced into the world. You should have kind of nail down your major factions. And you should also, these should be limited, definitely. Like you don't want to go over, in my opinion. I think 3 is the sweet spot, but you definitely don't want to go over like 4 or 5. Like that's just too much for the main factions. So what? Yeah, Chris, what do you think about that? What's your thoughts on the major factions?
I agree. I think 3 is a good number. I mean, every one of these factions that you are creating requires some amount of overhead to maintain. So
yeah,
if you're going over 3 or 4, like I think Forgotten Realms has 5, but they have a team of writers that handle that. So that's why they have 5. You as probably a one-person show, I think 3 is already a lot. So yeah, no more than 3, I think is absolutely right.
Well, and I think 3 gives you the ability to have them play off each other. There's something specific in the goals, and 3 is easy. You got 2 is kind of like I've got animosity and friction between these 2 groups trying to do things completely opposite. You add a third in, and now they can be adjacent. And that may be something that is more interesting to the party to go with this adjacent goal group. So that's why I think 3 is a sweet spot. It's not just there's not a black and white. There's like a little gray going on because there's 3 that all have some reason that they exist and something that they may be working against each other or be working together in a partnership or completely have different goals that are separate yet somehow Venn diagram ultimately as the players get involved.
Yeah, I think it's also important just to know that every one you add doesn't add 1. It's an exponential thing. It's because of all the interactions. You're not,
exactly. It's a graph. It's a graph.
A complex web. Yeah, that you'll need to stay up at 12 at midnight, like with red pins and strings, trying to track everything. So let's move on to the minor factions. So minor factions, in my opinion, are usually actually the more fun ones because you can get just so much crazier with them too. And for me, while I do create my own minor ones, player backstories are a great place to mine for minor ones. And often when I'm talking to a player, if they're kind of bringing in like their idea for something, I'll be like, oh yeah, write it up. Like we'll tweak it with each other, but write it up and we'll have this like new minor faction that's kind of in the world. Carl, what are some ideas about minor factions?
Well, I think you just hit the nail on the head. The minor factions are, again, they're close to the players. They have smaller goals, but are more important to them. But it's the players you can just hand this over to players to help you create factions based on their backstory. Like if a player's in a gang, tell me what this gang's about. What is their philosophy? What are they trying to accomplish? What are some of the rules that they live by that maybe has made your character the way they are because they live by that code of conduct or what have you. But you tell me, and we did that, that was another Cyberplex 2090. One of the players was in a gang, and it's like, okay, what's the gang? And they defined it. They told who the head of the gang.
Carl. That was me.
Well, also the there was another character who was in a biker gang. Yeah. So, but both of you guys, I let both of you guys take it and run with it, and it was smarter than I could have come up with. They had names, they had ranks, they had people. Here's a guy I know that I can talk to. It's like I didn't have to come up with any of that. So, but it's really cool. I think it's definitely a time to let what we call sourcing the table happen
for sure
with your players.
Chris?
I'd like so minor factions to me are experiments for future major factions.
Okay.
Like, maybe they just happen in one town and maybe you leave them behind at level 4 or something, you don't return. But, I get to do lots of experiments, see how this turned out without too much investment, in the overall major campaign. I think they're great. I think you can make them up on the fly, character backstories, people you ran into randomly, random encounters, all kinds of things lead to little minor factions.
Yeah, that's a really good point too, is that you can make them up on the fly. And so if later on, if you need something that, beyond just a single character, that you need to, like, for whatever story arc, or need to throw a wrench at the players, just creating a minor faction is such a smart way to do that. And like we said, it's like you're not going to, because minor factions kind of power and scope is more limited, you're not going to add too much complexity to the game where things are interacting and changing the way the world works, right? But it's changing the way the party's operating because they do have enough reach or power or whatever to kind of mess with the players. So minor ones are definitely great to kind of grab from a handbag. And don't be afraid to just, before your game starts, just jot down names of things. You don't have to do a description, just a couple of minor faction like names that you can just pull from if you need to without having to stop and think about it. So that's another good little tip. Cool. Let's move into just fleshing them out completely. I'm just going to start real quick that the main thing I think for fleshing them out is that you always think of them kind of like an NPC, quote unquote. Corporations are people, right? So you just think of them like you're making an NPC. Like if you want to make a detailed NPC, and so you think about their needs, wants, quirks, goals, and stuff, their history, all that stuff. Just approach them like you would do to make an important NPC. That's just the best way to start thinking about it, especially with the major factions. Chris, I think you have a lot of ideas on that. I'll throw it to you.
I think it's exactly that. Like little corporations, like little startups. When I make them, they all have a logo I've designed. They have a mission statement. They have goals. They have some kind of defined ranking or hierarchy system, and I make sure that there's some kind of metric too. This is kind of hard to define, but like I want to know how this faction will grow, how its reach will spread, how its influence will spread, and I need to know that in some not necessarily quantifiable way, but like a roundabout way, so I can understand how they're going through. But yeah, I think it's the character analogy is the best analogy I can think of. They need to be a living thing that evolves and changes as the characters do.
Carl?
Yeah, so I kind of have a framework to help, like I mentioned before, kind of the creativity. So I think about the faction as having three key elements that I think kind of align pretty well with what Chris was saying. So they have a goal, right? They're what are they accomplishing? What are they after? What are they, what's their point of existing? And then something I call a doctrine or ideals. Maybe somebody call it philosophy. I don't know, but it's like, what is the way they operate, or how do they get things done? And I think that plays to, like you're saying, with an NPC, right? NPCs have quirks. They work in a certain way. They do things a certain way. And then the last one that I think we didn't really touch on, though, is what I call limitations. What things do the factions do or don't do? What are they willing or unwilling to do as far as an action goes? Because you've got things like the Thieves Guild, and the Thieves Guild has desire to take over the city, and they desire this, but they may be completely willing to assassinate, versus another faction may just, no, we don't kill people because it's bad for business. And I think that's an important piece of it, because again, it's an NPC, and NPCs have the way they think of the world and things they do, and it's like if we think about the mob, right? If you're in the family, we're not going to touch you, even though they're the most violent people around, because they have limitations that they have as far as they work. So I think that's an important part that I wanted to touch on.
For sure. And just on top of all what you guys are saying, like I also will do things like that, and I like to think about their main area of interests and how they actually project their power. So kind of like what resources, tech, or a region, or et cetera. Like what do they want, and why do they want those things? Like going, like, I think that what Chris was saying, like how they grow is kind of like, what are their goals, right? We said. And I also like to think about like what unique technology or magic, like something like that, et cetera. What gives them the edge? Why did they get so powerful, right? So like, just as an example for my game that I'm running now, what I call Heroes of Farshore, I have two of the major factions. One's called the Reinhold Imperium. One's called the Suniketh Magirocracy. The Reinhold Imperium are kind of like a northern country, and they've kind of mastered the use of fire and ice magic. They also like capture elementals, and they're all about order. Like this religious order has taken over. But then, so their ships that they have are like these iron ships that utilize an elemental engine and can fire, special guns that, unlike other people who just have normal cannons, they have ice cannons and flamethrower kind of things, right? That's their kind of what's given them a lot of an edge at these big constructs that can use basically engines. And the Sunni Keth Imperium, they're all about like economy and alchemy, but they also have levitation magic, and that kind of goes throughout their society. And so they have like floating barges, things like that, right? So I think it's also really important to think about like how have they gotten so powerful? Like what's their unique edge if it's something like a country or some type of faction like that.
So on the
Chris?
on the topic of having limitations and some kind of code of ethics and unique tech or equipment, I think that we can just, as a side note, remember that anything with a code of ethics can have a paladin that represents that with this,
for sure, yeah,
with this unique tech. So that's a whole different character you got right there.
Yeah, I'll often make, like when I'm making my games, especially if it's Savage Worlds, which makes it so easy to make NPCs, like I'll make, a folder of that country, and I'll have like some of their units, right, with their unique things on them that kind of makes them feel different too if they ever encounter them. So yeah, that's a really cool thing to do. And again, and when you're making a game, I think it is important when, and we've talked about this in other episodes with your kind of, little player introduction document that you might have, is that it's important. You don't have to go into super detail, but if they're the major factions, right, then the players should probably know a little bit about them, that if they're operating within that space. So I often write up a blurb too, for the players that like, here's the general information that you'll definitely know about these main factions, right, because they're big enough. And then if there's a minor faction that's important to the party, I'll have a little blurb about them too. Carl, I need some more ideas. Oh, Chris, go ahead.
I do so much more than a blurb. This is like...
I do too, actually.
I think that in another life, I should have been like a graphic designer for a marketing firm or something, because I do full-on propaganda posters and, like I said, logos, stickers, like everything. If you were playing any of my games at a convention, I most likely will be giving you free stickers that I have painstakingly designed for no return.
Wow.
So I maybe take a little more of a leaner approach. I talk about the goals, the ideals, and the limitations, and I kind of focus on that and try to keep the big picture, because I really, sometimes these major factions turn into a nothing burger, that don't really get engaged, and the minor ones become much more important. So I try to avoid over prepping on some of this stuff, and I'm not saying there's anything good, bad, or indifferent. It's just from a personal standpoint, I don't over prep my my factions until the players really engage with them. Then it's like, okay, now we understand. Like the Wardens in the game we are playing now, you were a member of the Wardens, Eric, and
yeah,
it was like I sent you on an adventure based on the Wardens, and I didn't know whether that was going to turn into a very important part of the story, and it did. So it's like, oh, let's take what Eric had defined as the Wardens and flesh them out and make them much more rich, and then that sort of thing. So just a personal preference.
Yeah, I think, on that note, for sure. There's over prepping, of course. So when you're doing a major faction, like, and you want to write something about them, make sure that your story is going to be affected by them. That's just like a given. If they're going to be more in the background maybe, and you think they might encounter them, then yeah, you don't necessarily need to do the whole blurbs about them, right? I think for my game, like going into it, where I had these blurbs about, and what I do is I do history, government. I then do main focus power, religion if they have it, and then their kind of population and what they're doing in the region that the players are playing in, right? But these things are going to be a powerful influence on the players. Like they're going to be encountering them at some point. So it was important for them to know kind of what they're getting into.
Well, and
right?
these were your critical few, right? These literally
exactly,
were what's driving the
few.
story. So there's no chance that the players won't engage with them, because they're literally defining the story that you're playing. Yeah.
So also with factions, I think it's, again, don't be afraid to mine media for ideas, like, books, movies, TV shows. You can certainly bring in like Brotherhood of Steel. I want to bring in like a Brotherhood of Steel, which is from Fallout, which are kind of, they're kind of like technological technocrats, I guess. I don't know. They hoard technology for themselves as like this holy mission kind of. That's a great thing to bring in, but you don't want to carbon copy them, right? You can bring that idea in and switch it to fit your world. But yeah, just don't be afraid to mine media, because just like players coming up with their own ideas, like you're going to have what you are influenced by and what you can create, and players and other people who write things are going to have totally different kind of points of view, right? So don't be afraid to mine things. Chris, any more thoughts on this?
I have no more thoughts on that. Only because my mic just died and everything, and I couldn't hear what you guys said. But I'm sure it was very insightful.
Got it. Okay.
It was probably the bestest ideas that have ever been presented on any RPG podcast ever. It's a shame
you would have ascended into Nirvana if you heard it. Yes. So I'm sorry that didn't happen. One other thing I wanted to put, and I think Carl, you mentioned this before, is that for me, gray all day. Like just like mostly with villains, right? We talked about in the Nemesis episode. You don't make some factions just the absolute evil, right? Don't make some factions just the absolute good. I mean, no society is perfect, right? Even the ones that are purporting democracy is messy, all that kind of stuff, right? Like in the Pathfinder world, there's the Chris, I can't remember their name. They're the people that like worship devils. Or they use devils. I'm totally spacing out on their name.
I can't remember it either.
But they're all about order, and they use devils, and they're generally they do like take over countries. But they're also like, when you play through Wrath of the Righteous, they're kind of an ally because they're good about fighting devils and demons, right? So you're never going to be totally just one kind of alignment, right? Even if something is kind of more totalitarian, like in my game, I have a very totalitarian faction. They're still providing a lot of the military might in the game that are fighting the actual kind of big bads. So yeah, I just think always have gray area when it comes to factions.
Well, and the gray part is you sometimes just don't even know if the factions, the good guys, bad guys, are indifferent, right? I mean, it's just the goals, either they may align or not. Like, for example, in the game we're playing now, you guys went to the city that worships dragons. And from everything you started, the information you got was that dragons were the bad guys. But here's this city that's a gleaming gem of society and beauty and everything, and they worship dragons. So are they really the good guys, bad guys? Is it how are you guys going to align with them or not align? So it's really kind of interesting to make them flesh them out like you would a not an evil big bad guy, but just any other NPC that has an interesting story to them.
Yeah, if you ever play in a game of Mind, I can tell you right now, all the factions are bad. Everything is always bad. Everything with power is always corrupt at some level, so it's really just how you experience it.
Got it. All right. Yeah, but they can still help the players at points, right?
Oh,
they're not just going to murder the player, so that's still great, right?
Yeah. It's more how bad each one is. Like, which one is the worst?
Which one's the not as bad one that you can deal with?
The lesser evil. They say.
Let's throw in some examples now. I think just some off. I'll just throw in some of mine that I put in. I put a pirate council interested in becoming legitimate but stuck in a gridlock of leadership. Another one that just pulling from my game now, a country obsessed with wealth, alchemy, and levitation magic, extending their influence into an island chain to gather unique flora. Another one I have is a religion based around a death deity, but that are focused on healing and have clinics all over all over the world, right? But then people kind of maybe skeeved out by the religion, but they appreciate the hospitals. What are some factions for you, Chris? Some examples.
I have a lot of cults. I don't, no comment about why I have so many cults, but I do have a lot of cults. And they're always working for something, on the sideline. It's like another set of characters running around getting supplies and doing things. I really like those. And pirates. I always have pirates.
Gotta love pirates.
Yeah, because they have, they're on the water. They can have a hideout and they can operate pretty much outside of any city or law or whatever. So pirates and cults are my typical big ones.
And everything's better with pirates, right? So
yes.
Well, I those are really traditional, but just think about like a global corporation like has this goal of developing the most powerful AI to take over the city, run everybody's life. That's their goal. And is that evil? Is that good? Maybe the way they're doing it is, they're framing rivals and, getting them for fraud, and it's all bad, evil, but it's not killing. It's not assassinating. They've got limitations on what they're doing, but it's it's a entity that you're working against, or you may say, hey, no, I like AI to take over the city. I'm with them, and let me help them get there. So that's like just an example of one that I just put together as I was thinking through it. But in a lot of my games, there's tons of factions. We just played one that was a science fiction game where there's actually the bad guys and the good guys were two of the same set of creatures.
Splintered.
Yeah. They're just one group was a splintered group, and it took a while for you guys to trust them, right? Because they could be the bad guys and be playing you for the fool, because on the outside, you guys looking in, it was like, well, they're the same as the bad guys, so aren't they just the bad guys? Very cool.
Carl, that's a really good tip too. I forgot to mention that is that splintering a faction, having a splintered part of a faction, is a really easy and interesting way to have another kind of set of influence going on and make it a little bit different and really play it. That's just a really easy way to do that. So that was a good thing to add in for sure. Okay, let's move on to kind of tips on how we actually utilize factions, how we affect the players and affect the world. Starting out with the economy, right? Factions can certainly influence the economy. Carl, what's your thoughts on this?
Well, I think you were hitting on it before, right? At a global level or at a more macro level, I mean, the technology or the resources or the things that they have that they're using to kind of drive the story forward will have huge effects on how the economy, how the world works with respect to, money, technology, all those kinds of things. And they can, with these folks having large amounts of money or really owning the economy, they would be the ones that could offer jobs, could have interesting things that they bring to the table for the players. And, I'm looking through kind of our notes, and one of the things that stuck out to me is the big moves, right? These are big ones can do big things because they have control of the economy, so they can be buying businesses or, basically changing the course of a nation potentially with the ability. I mean, they're the villains sometimes, the Fed, but they change the course of the economy just by doing their job. So, that's the economy is a big part of what a faction could influence in the world.
Yeah, go on, Chris.
Oh, I was going to say, sort of related to this economy and how they can control the economy, I have something that I internally call the healing potion indicator. And that is when they go into town and they want to buy all the healing potions, which they always do, they're not there anymore because X faction recently bought them all, which they find with a little bit of inquiry. And that sure enough gets them to learn about the faction or head over there or whatever. It's like every time it always happens.
Yeah, that's a really good way to get them to get players interested in a faction. If you want them to, is take something away from them or limit them in some way, and they'll certainly go after it. And on top of what Carl was saying, when we're talking about kind of the big moves, this is a really good way. The economy, especially, I think, is a really good way. But it's for all of these kind of points we're going to make, reacting to either the party's actions or the villain's actions, right? And we talked about this in the Nemesis, some of the other villain episodes, where if the villain has moved into a certain country, then a faction might get pushed out and might start to take over stuff in that country, right? Or switch the trade. If there's war brewing, then this faction's going to come in and want to sell weapons or whatever, or start trying to take over mines and stuff, right? That the players might, this was a mine for this village, but now the village has been taken over by the faction because they want access to ores to make weapons or something. So you can be very reactive as far as the markets and what they're doing and why they're buying certain resources. So definitely a really fun way to influence things. Anybody else have ideas on the economy?
One more comment about the economy is it can also be used, and I think we'll get into this later with items, but the economy can be used as a gold sink for players that have too much money. And these factions can just help unload some of that in the way of items.
Or the factions, they notice they have too much money, and now the factions start becoming after them to relieve them of their well, I
Or
don't
make
know.
deals with them, right?
Or
Oh,
make
here's some
deals,
influential
yeah.
party.
Yeah.
And not just items. I mean, we're also talking about like favors, right? And they might be like, so in like a cyberpunk game, you might have to, a faction might be like, well, we'll sell you, you can use our like jet or whatever, the flying, I forget what they're called, but like floating cars, right? Our armored thing to kind of pay us for that, right? That's going to be another, they could offer services to the party to kind of alleviate some of that money as well, which can be fun. Let's move into kind of power. How does factions influence the world through power? Which you can often is linked to the economy, but a little different. Chris, any thoughts on this?
No, I think the power. I would say there is a little bit of link to the economy in a way too. That people of a certain ranking, a power level of a faction may have a discount to just saying if they want to rise up in the ranks. But yeah, factions and power like sway or political sway or preference, like goods or whatever. They're first come first serve. For the big powerful factions get the first take. And then as far as like forces to be reckoned with, right? Like there are some that are an order of librarians maybe isn't this, but there are some that are warlords and armies, and that power too means if you have to pay the toll to exist somewhere, pass through, or open a business at, or whatever, that these things are now people you must address and you must visit or somehow take heed of and make a deal with just for you to do something in their area of influence.
I think that's a really good point you're making. That they'll have an area of influence, and that it can drive the party's reaction or how the party can take action. If they go into a town and it's no longer friendly to them because it's now more in control of a faction, then that can direct the players to do something without actually having the faction bad guys show up and have a battle with them, right? It drives the story without kind of directly confronting them. So that's a good point.
Yeah,
for sure.
It's also a good way. I think we talked about this before, but when you need guardrails for the party, factions are a great way to have that. If you need them to okay, I kind of want to push them this way, having a faction move for a certain area for whatever reason, right? Whether they want to take over the region or capitalize on a resource, or they're kind of getting ready to go at war with somebody, something like that. It could be a great way to kind of move the party along or directly confront them of you can't be here. Also with the power, kind of like power plays of factions, this could be an interesting, either different factions or splinter factions like Carl brought up. Having players choose sides, starting to get them to force, okay, you need to choose a side. We're getting to the wire now. You got to choose one of these factions or one of these groups within the faction. Can be a really cool way. Yeah, go on, Chris.
Just going back to that power thing, I think it's also, like you said, it changes the landscape and it makes a familiar place new again. Like I've been to Waterdeep 100 times. Yeah, but you haven't been to Waterdeep under pirate control. Now it's far different. Everything is different here.
Yeah. So within the whole power and political influence kind of umbrella, I think another way to really show off factions influencing things is have them, lobby the governments, right? If they're not the government themselves, then have, whatever the pro healing potion faction be levy bigger taxes on healing potions all of a sudden, or whatever. Just having them make laws to fit whatever the agenda they have, and then having those laws affect the party is another really good way of having the factions mean something to players.
Well, and
Carl?
And the politicians or the lords, or lots of times they're the face of a faction that's working in the background to make their machinations come true. And so you have a face that is driving building laws or bending the king's ear, and that they've got, maybe it's a cult, right? Indiana Jones, right? There's a cult behind the scenes going on.
You're saying every politician really represents some secret organization behind them? That sounds so unfathomable. I don't know if I can picture that.
Lizard people. It's all lizard people all
Yeah.
the way down from the top down. So
Cool. Okay. I think we should talk about. I think we've all touched on this at some point, but let's actually talk about kind of the specific quests and items that factions might. And what's the Chris? I think you had some ideas on this. Oh, I think he lost Mike. So
okay.
yeah. I talked a little bit about this with my, my faction who's into levitation magic, right? So tailoring specific quests based on all the things we've talked about, right? Tailoring the kind of items they can have. This can really change things up for players. Having specialized stores, having specialized items that are only available through those factions will then want to make players kind of go to those factions to do jobs for them. So in my game, I have special cannons and ship types that are only available through those factions, right? So the levitation ones, they have special levitation guns, and they have their glide ships, they're called, which can basically are like hovercrafts. And if you want those things, you basically have to go to those factions to get them. So that's just another cool way. Carl, any thoughts about this kind of stuff?
You mean as far as items and yeah,
just specific quests and yeah.
Yeah, I think the factions, you can leverage their agendas and what they want to get done to be the things that they bring the party in for, because the party's specialized in doing something along those lines, and then they can provide them the resources in the future to accomplish something that the party wants, so that they owe a favor or the party owes them a favor. And so that pulls them into quests that maybe the party wouldn't necessarily want to do on their own, but they know a guy who knew a guy who they owe a favor to because they found them one of those levitation ships for their ship or what have you. Yeah. So.
And Christian, we lost you on the mic. Are you back with us?
Yeah, I don't know what's happening.
All good. So we're talking about faction-specific quests and items. So we've gone over some of that stuff, but I think you had some ideas as well on that.
Yeah, I think there is some very, and I apologize that you mentioned any of these, but factions can be very specific, have very specific gear, like say they're a vampire hunting faction and you can only get this special crossbow through them, or a special make of armor, or maybe they sell all the fire resistance gear, like you're in Warcraft again. Maybe that's what you need to go do and get it, or maybe only members of their faction can buy it. You can get this, but you have to be minimum a sergeant in this order of knights to even go to that area to purchase it. So I think there's lots of cool things you can do with that.
And on top of that, even if the players are able to get some of this faction-specific equipment, that it won't be good if the faction sees them and they didn't get it legitimately, right? So that's always a fun mechanic to play with too. One of the other kind of little tips, just mechanic, I guess, here is kind of faction influence tracking, which, we have in video games at times, but I like to influence. I like to add this into my games at some points. So what I mean by this is, have a little, actual track, maybe on the landing page. If you're in person, have somebody tracking on a piece of paper or something. But just a basic kind of some type of graph or something that actually tracks how much influence you have with each faction, I think can be a fun thing. Sometimes it's maybe not appropriate, but I like using it. My only kind of tips here would be that you keep it small. Don't have 25 points, positive, negative, right? Have 4 points, 5 points. You know what I mean? Where it actually meaningful jumps. But it's just a cool way that it kind of provides something that players can look to that provides social advantages and disadvantages, as well as monetary, discounts when dealing with their services or with their gear. And if you guys ever do kind of actual influence tracking like that?
I have not.
Okay.
As far as the influence of the factions themselves, I'll do a node graph that shows as they progress. But the players interacting, normally what I've done is just if they are in good graces, then they get bonuses on rolls, and they're either in good graces or they're not. But
okay.
But I can see where you're coming from, right? That's very similar to the dark side, light side tracking mechanic that's in Star Wars games, right? You're
for sure, yeah.
I could see where you're coming from.
Chris, have you ever used this?
Yeah, I use it because I got it from World of Warcraft when I used to play that. Is that
Okay.
you have certain reputation amongst the factions, and that matters. Like you said, for purchases, for access, for information that's still divulged to you. Because some factions may be the only source of information. Maybe they have spies that have been monitoring the person you care about, and then they have extensive notes or something. But you can't get that as an outsider. You can only get it with X amount of reputation.
It definitely helps, like at least me, it helps me keep track of, kind of this linear progression of like, well, at stage 1 or stage 2, that's when they start opening up the gear to them, and then stage 3 is a 10% discount. Stage 4 is like a 50% discount, right? I can actually have that, and I don't have to kind of remember that and have this where it will then feel to the players, oh, they actually really are progressing with this faction, right? That's what I talked about before, that meta progression. So yeah. Maybe worth trying out if you haven't done it before. Okay, I think finally, to wrap this up, we should kind of talk about some of the faction growth and decline, and how they grow, how they decline. Chris, I think you like doing this a lot, right?
Yes, I. Again, this is back to the character analogy, and I think it's a reaction to what your players have done. It's a reaction to how your world is changing, and it's sort of like even we talked about the newsletters and ticker tape and whatever coming from factions, and this is all part of the power influence, the area, the amassment of population that these factions can go through, and a growing force or a declining force is a notable event enough to change its weight in your mind or in the players as they care about your story. So if something needs to be more important in its power grows or its influence grows, that makes it in the forefront more. And if it needs to shrivel down and cease, that is another thing that can and does happen. And sometimes it's directly. Your players could disband a faction with a single encounter if it was a pivotal, right? So
a linchpin or whatever, right?
Yeah, totally. Right. Yeah, you like took down the entire crime syndicate. Good job. That kind of thing. So yeah, I think this is super important. The progression of a faction, the growth of a faction, it is its own personification of like a character.
Yeah.
And it needs to graduate to another level. Staying stagnant, it would just kill it, right? If it's always the same, it's kind of boring. It needs to change, and it needs to evolve.
And I think factions changing, growing out of anything in the world is the best indicator of change happening. Beyond countries and armies moving in, like that's really going to show things are happening behind the scenes when you have a faction growing in influence or declining in influence. Carl, what about you?
And I think what's really interesting, an interesting thing to do is if the party aligns with a faction, what's really interesting is when that faction's in decline and someone else is kind of coming into the territory, growing, and the player's influence is becoming less because of the decline, and now they need to do something about it. Are they going to join the new faction? Are they better? And we want to get their equipment because they now have the equipment, and our faction's on the decline. So the sort of that meta change it can be really kind of interesting, I think.
Yeah, for sure. And I think what all of us were saying is, and we talked about this in the Nemesis episode, we talked about this in other episodes, is just, again, treat them like characters, right? And your main characters, your big bads, your most influential people, like, should grow or should decline. And so when you think about it that way, like, that's what shows the reactivity in the world, for sure. Finally, I just wanted to touch on villainous factions a little bit. We've talked about this in the some of the other villain episodes, but yeah, we definitely talked about factions backing up a villain and giving them more flavor. But in regards to this episode, I think it's important to kind of say that the villainous faction doesn't always have to align perfectly with the villain, right? It doesn't always have to be that the villain is the head of that faction necessarily. They could be one of the heads, or they could be like the current head, but there's rumblings going on that are different in there. And I think that is fun to play with. If you do have a villain with a faction, don't be afraid to have it not be so coherent. So so just 100% behind the villain at all times, and maybe even have infighting, or like Carl brought up before, in that main villain faction there was a fracture, there was a splinter, right? So it's fun not just to make it kind of a monoculture of some type of faction. Any thoughts on this, Chris?
Yeah, the same as as we were talking about the personification of a faction or how it can be like a character, I think important to note that a villainous faction also can have a redemption arc. It doesn't have to stay that way. And it could be process, part of its process is that it starts out one way, but, it can go in whatever direction.
Carl?
I think you hit it. That's where I was going to go, is that there's a redemption arc possibility for these factions as the players become part of them and twist, their thinking. And again, the goals may not align all the time, but it's not necessarily evil.
Yeah. All right. I think we packed a lot in that episode. I mean, there's definitely more to talk about. It's such an expansive thing, but any final thoughts, gents?
I just want to say I love factions, and I think they add so much to it. I try to use them as much as possible.
Carl?
Well, I think it comes down to what did we hit? Treat them like NPCs, have a little structure in how you define them, with goals and limitations and quirks and all those kind of things. And don't be afraid to have them grow and change, and don't be afraid to make it uncomfortable for the players to kind of decide which way they're going to go. They have to narratively think, what's the best approach that I can take? So that's my final thoughts.
Yeah, don't be afraid to kill them off too. I think that's an important step. Is that can really shake things up for people. But I think as a final thought for me again is, I think you should always try to have some sort of faction in. If it does intimidate you, then just limit them to two, probably one or two. But always try to have some type of faction in. And again, this always depends on the scope of the game, right? If you think like my game is just taking place on a wilderness or whatever, and there's very little people around, or there's just villages and stuff, you could still have very minor factions in that, right? That's just maybe like, this is just the local religion that is fighting against this other local religion. They're not big, right? They're just there. Or there's just some the hunter caste, right, is a faction in itself, and the head of the hunter caste is trying to kind of bring them up higher in the hierarchy, things like that. So I think it's just always a good idea to have factions, and if you're intimidated by it, just limit it, but just try to have something in. Okay.
Very cool. All right. Well, hey, great episode. Lots of good information there. Appreciate it. So thanks everyone for tuning in. I hope you got something out of it. Remember to drop by masteringtherpg.com to learn about our other projects, things we're working on, contact and support us. Please email gamemaster@masteringtherpg.com if you've got questions, need some advice, got topics, or your own ideas. We're all for it. And then, of course, Eric would love to adjudicate some differences of opinion. When is that going to happen? Come on, people.
I don't know.
Make them up, even if you don't have any. Make them up if you send them in. So if you like the show, hey, please give us a positive review wherever you can. We'd love to keep doing it. So once again, this is Carl with Eric and Chris. Say goodbye, guys.
Happy gaming.
Yep, that's fun.